The New Psychologica, how modern psychology became the new priesthood. For centuries, suffering was framed through the lens of religion. The cause of suffering was sin, the burden was guilt, and the only cure was repentance. The moral order of the universe dictated that suffering was either a divine punishment or a test of faith, and the only path forward was to seek salvation through confession, penance, and obedience. But today, suffering is framed in medical terms. Instead of sin, we now have disorder. Instead of guilt, we now have diagnosis. And instead of repentance, we now have therapy and medication. At first glance, this might seem like a great advancement. Science replacing superstition, medicine replacing moral judgment. But Nietzsche peels back the illusion and reveals a darker truth. The core structure of the old religious psychologica remains completely intact. Only the labels have changed. The structural parallels between religion and modern psychology. 1. From sin to mental disorder. In the past, sin was the fundamental flaw in human nature. Today, mental illness is the fundamental flaw in human nature. In both cases, individuals are told that they are broken, that there is something inherently wrong with them. Just as priests classified people as sinners, psychologists now classify people as mentally ill, defining which thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are normal and which ones need correction. Nietzsche would have rejected this system outright, arguing that human nature cannot be standardized into categories of normal and abnormal. He warns, 2. From confession to therapy. In religious traditions, believers were expected to confess their sins to a priest in order to receive forgiveness and guidance. The act of confession was a cleansing ritual, a way to acknowledge one's flaws and seek redemption. Today, we have therapy. People go to psychologists and confess their thoughts, traumas, and personal struggles. The therapist, like the priest, listens with authority, offers a diagnosis, and prescribes a path to healing. Nietzsche would ask, 1. Are we truly liberated by therapy, or are we still conditioned to seek external validation? 2. Is therapy a process of self-empowerment, or just a modern form of religious atonement? 3. Are people encouraged to confront and overcome their suffering, or just to pacify it? 3. From damnation to diagnosis. In Christianity, damnation was the ultimate condemnation of the soul, a spiritual death sentence. Today, a mental health diagnosis functions in the same way. 1. A diagnosis labels a person permanently. They are told they have a disorder, a condition, a lifelong struggle that requires treatment. 2. Just as damnation was decided by the priest, diagnosis is now decided by the psychologist or psychiatrist, with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, as their holy book. 3. Once a person has a label, they see themselves through that lens forever, just as sinners once saw themselves through the lens of religious judgment. But Nietzsche rejects these labels, arguing that suffering should not be turned into pathology. He would ask, instead of seeing struggle as a defect, he saw it as a necessity for greatness. 4. From penance to medication. In religious tradition, those who sinned were expected to atone through prayer, fasting, and repentance. These rituals purified the soul, bringing the individual back into divine alignment. Today, people atone for their suffering through psychiatric medication. 1. If they feel anxious, they are prescribed sedatives. 2. If they feel depressed, they are prescribed antidepressants. 3. If they feel restless, they are prescribed stimulants. Nietzsche would have warned against this pathologization of suffering. He saw pain not as a burden to be eliminated, but as a force of transformation. His warning is clear. Modern psychiatry treats symptoms instead of addressing the deeper existential crisis of human suffering. And in doing so, it creates a culture that medicates pain instead of learning from it. 5. From salvation to treatment, religion promises salvation. If one follows the doctrines, obeys the rules, and repents properly, they will be saved. Their suffering will end, and they will find peace. Psychology promises the same thing. 1. If you follow therapy, you will heal. 2. If you take your prescribed medication, you will feel better. 3. If you accept the diagnosis, you will understand yourself. But Nietzsche would argue that this entire structure is a lie. He rejected the idea that human beings need saving, whether from sin or from psychological disorder. Instead of asking, "How can I be fixed?" Nietzsche asks, "How can I use my suffering to become stronger? How can I transform my pain into power?" There is no external treatment for the human condition. There is only the will to power. 6. From priests to psychologists in the past, the priest was the ultimate authority on moral and spiritual matters. He dictated what was righteous and what was sinful. Today, the psychologist is the ultimate authority on mental health and well-being. He dictates what is normal and what is disordered. Both priests and psychologists hold the power to declare individuals flawed and in need of correction. Nietzsche would ask, the Nietzschean alternative, strength instead of therapy. Modern psychology tells us, you are sick, you need treatment. Nietzsche says, you are struggling, you need transformation. 1. Pain is not a disease, it is a test. 2. Depression is not a disorder, it is an existential crisis demanding reinvention. 3. Madness, ease, is not always an illness, it is sometimes the price of genius. Instead of seeing struggle as a pathology, Nietzsche saw it as the forge of greatness. He did not want to eliminate suffering. He wanted to make people strong enough to face it, harness it, and transcend it. Final thought: do you want to be medicated or empowered? Psychology tells us that mental health is the goal. Nietzsche tells us that power is the goal. So ask yourself, do you want a life free of struggle or a life full of strength? Do you want to be sedated or to awaken? Do you want to be treated or do you want to conquer yourself? Nietzsche's challenge is clear. Reject the medicalization of suffering. Embrace the transformation of struggle. Because the greatest human beings in history were never normal. They were extraordinary.